The eviction notice was shoved onto the old wooden table with a dry, abrupt push. No protest, no pleading, just a silence that made the people across from him shift uncomfortably in their seats. Ethan Cole did not read it again. He had read it enough times on the drive here. Enough for every cold, legal sentence to carve itself into his memory like a blade. The Homeowners Association declared that this land would be seized for community safety reasons. The explanation was neat, lawful, and completely emotionless. The old dam was labeled dangerous. The creek was framed as a threat, and the landowner, as they put it, was simply a man who had been gone too long. Ethan pushed his chair back and stood up. Slowly, deliberately, he placed a thick folder with a cracked leather cover in the exact center of the table. His eyes did not meet anyone else's. Instead, he looked down at the time-worn surface of the wood, the same table where his grandfather once sat counting rainy seasons, 1 year at a time. Water always remembers its old path. And land remembers who kept their promise to it first. No one in that room knew how far back this story went. But Ethan did. He remembered the smell of wet mud clinging to his boots when he was a child. He remembered the low, steady murmur of water running beneath the dam during heavy rains. He remembered his grandfather's slow, grounded voice saying that this dam was never built to make money. It was built so the whole valley could survive the dry years. They did not know that. And because they did not, they had signed papers against the wrong man. On the drive back to the family land, Ethan passed rows of new houses rising like weeds after rain. Identical roofs. Lawns cut so short, they looked stripped bare. Shiny signs bearing the Homeowners Association logo lined the entrance road, polished and confident. Not a single one mentioned the name that existed here long before the first stretch of asphalt was ever poured. When he stopped the car, Ethan turned off the engine but did not get out right away. Through the windshield, he saw cranes, concrete mixers, and wooden stakes jammed into what had once been open pasture. Land they called abandoned. Land his grandfather had handed to him with a quiet nod before he passed away. In the distance, Linda Harrow stood with the management team. Spotless white shoes, a bright jacket. Her expression calm, as if everything had been under control for a long time. When she saw Ethan approaching, her gaze slid over him, the way one dismisses an insignificant detail. In her mind, he was just a late-returning landowner, someone who did not understand the new rules, an easy name to push aside. Linda smiled, the smile of people who believe they stand on the side of the community. She spoke about safety, about children, about standards everyone must follow. She did not mention the creek that had been diverted. She did not mention the water level dropping day after day. She did not mention the dam that had stood firm through decades of storms when there was not a single house downstream. Ethan listened. He did not interrupt. He did not argue. In his mind, the numbers were already forming with the clarity of a map. Water flow before and after the diversion, the natural slope of the original creek bed, the pressure building behind the dam. He saw what they refused to see, or chose not to see. In that moment, everyone carried their own story. Linda believed she was protecting order. The workers believed they were just doing their jobs. Future residents believed this place would become a peaceful dream. No one believed that the quiet man standing in front of them, dusty jacket and calm expression, was the variable capable of collapsing the entire plan. Ethan turned away, his eyes passing over the narrow creek forced out of its natural path. The water so low that cracked mud showed through the bottom. He paused a second longer than necessary. In his chest, what stirred was not anger, but a cold, deep resolve. They had underestimated him, and that was their first mistake. Because Ethan Cole was not just a landowner who came back late. He understood water better than anyone in this town. And when water begins to reclaim its path, no sign, no polished smile is strong enough to stop it. Metal slammed against metal with a harsh, jarring screech as the old iron gate was yanked open. The dirt road leading toward the dam, once marked only by farm truck tracks, was now gouged deep by the heavy tires of construction vehicles. Ethan stood motionless, staring at the scene, feeling as if someone had just trespassed on a vital piece of his family's living memory. It was not the damaged gate that struck him, but the blunt confidence of people who believed this place no longer belonged to anyone. Red dust rose with every step the workers took, clouding the surface of the water that was steadily shrinking inside the reservoir. The smell of engine oil mixed with dry earth, sharp and suffocating. In Ethan's mind, memories rewound. His grandfather had once rested a hand on his shoulder, pointed to the gentle flow below, and said that when people forget how to listen to water, water will force them to listen. Back then, Ethan was too young to understand what that meant. Now, he understood all too well. He bent down and picked up a small stone from the edge of the creek. The flow had been bent out of shape, forced through a freshly poured concrete channel that felt cold and lifeless. The water no longer whispered. It groaned. Linda Harrow appeared behind him, high heels never touching the mud. She stopped at just the right distance to preserve the image of a composed leader. To her, Ethan was an inconvenient variable, but not a dangerous one. Just a man who had come back too late, carrying outdated nostalgia that no longer fit the modern world. She spoke in a soft but firm voice, saying the area was being redeveloped for the common good, that the new homes would bring value, security, and a future, that the old dam no longer met modern standards, that the creek needed to be controlled. Every sentence flowed smoothly, logically, as if rehearsed countless times in front of a mirror. Ethan did not argue. He studied the fine cracks along the dam's surface, scars of time that only someone familiar would recognize as harmless. He watched the water being siphoned out of the basin, little by little, steadily, intentionally. In his mind, calculations formed automatically. Flow rates before and after the diversion. Pressure changes as the water level dropped. The cumulative impact of each dry day. He saw what they refused to see, or chose not to see. Linda did not see those numbers. She saw local authority, permits, signatures. She interpreted Ethan's silence as a form of surrender. At the edge of the site, a few workers glanced at him with curiosity. They did not know who he was. They only knew they were being paid to do a job. To them, this was just another project, another old dam being replaced. None of them sensed the tension thickening in the air, like humidity before a storm. Ethan turned and walked away, leaving Linda with a faint sense of victory. She believed this story would end with a few more signatures, another meeting, and one man forced to accept a new reality. She did not notice Ethan's expression as he left. Not anger, not despair, just the cold focus of someone who had finally identified the real battlefield. That evening, Ethan sat alone in the old wooden house. Yellow light spilled over black and white photographs on the walls. His grandfather stood beside the newly built dam, smiling gently but with quiet resolve. Old notebooks lay open, their yellowed pages filled with careful handwriting. Each line marked a rainy season. Each entry a spillway release that saved downstream farms. Each one a reminder of responsibility. Outside, the water continued to be drained away. Quietly, without spectacle, but enough to shift the balance. Ethan felt it as clearly as his own heartbeat. He knew that if the flow kept being distorted, the consequences would not stop at this land. They would travel downstream, to places no one on the Homeowners Association board had even considered. In town, whispers began to surface. Some spoke about the creek growing weaker. An elderly farmer complained that his irrigation pond was drying up faster than usual. A restaurant owner noticed a strange muddy smell in the water. Small pieces clicked into place inside Ethan's mind. They thought he only carried memories. They did not know he carried knowledge, discipline, and a kind of power that did not come from titles or nameplates. The power of someone who understands a system from the inside. The power of someone who knows exactly where a small change can force everything back into its natural order. Ethan closed the notebook. In the quiet room, the steady drip of water from an old pipe echoed clearly. He closed his eyes and took a deep breath. This was never about land. It was about water. And water, sooner or later, always reclaims its voice. The police car stopped right at the edge of the creek, red and blue lights reflecting off water so shallow that dry gray stones were exposed beneath the surface. Ethan stood still as the officer stepped out, one hand resting loosely on his belt, eyes alert but tired. The man did not want to be here, Ethan could tell, but the file in his hand said there was a dispute, and disputes always required a witness. The officer's voice was steady and procedural. There had been a complaint. There were reports of unsafe construction. There was a temporary request to restrict the landowner's access to the dam area until the homeowners association completed its review. Each sentence was delivered like a ritual he had performed too many times before. Ethan listened, nodded, and did not resist. He had expected this move. In his mind, an invisible map was unfolding, not of land boundaries, but of power. Who made the call? Who signed the paper? Who stood behind the request that sounded neutral on the surface? Linda Harrow did not appear this time. She did not need to. She had learned how to let others do the dirty work for her. In an air-conditioned office, she was checking her meeting schedule, sipping coffee, convinced the gears were finally turning the right way. A lone landowner, a slow legal process, an outcome that seemed inevitable. The officer looked at Ethan, waiting for a reaction. Maybe he expected anger, or at least frustration. But Ethan only looked down at the creek, where water once rushed hard enough to shake the rocks along its banks. Now it lay bare and silent, as if holding its breath. Ethan asked a single, quiet question. Was this creek authorized to be diverted? The officer froze for a brief moment. No one had asked him that before. He flipped through the paperwork, scanning the dry text for an answer. There was none. Only construction permits. Only safety reports. Nothing about the water itself. Ethan thanked him and walked away. The conversation ended as quickly as it had begun. But inside the officer's mind, a grain of sand had slipped into the machinery. He did not know why that question unsettled him, only that it would follow him home that night. In the days that followed, the town began to murmur. Not loudly, not explosively, just scattered conversations. One mother mentioned that her garden hose seemed weaker. A farmer complained that his irrigation pond was drying up earlier than usual, even though peak dry season had not arrived. An elderly teacher recalled that the creek had never been this quiet before. Linda heard these comments and dismissed them. In her mind, such small inconveniences could not compete with zoning plans and property values climbing week after week. She believed people would adapt to any change as long as it was labeled progress. Ethan did not dismiss them. He drove along the distorted flow, noting every irregularity. He spoke with people who had no voice in meeting rooms, but carried memories longer than any report. They told him about old rainy seasons, about times when water rose and fell exactly when it needed to, saving entire fields. They looked at him cautiously, not ready to believe, but not hopeless either. That evening, in the wooden house, Ethan spread old maps across the floor. Lamplight traced faded hand-drawn lines. He laid the new maps over them. Sharp, straight lines cutting through the creek's natural curves. Two worlds layered together, misaligned. And that misalignment was the key. Meanwhile, at the Homeowners Association office, Linda signed another stack of documents. A safety meeting was scheduled. A press statement was drafted, speaking of responsibility and community protection. She did not think about the man measuring water levels in the dark. She did not think about the numbers no report mentioned. The plot twist began forming from her own confidence. Linda believed power lived in signatures and stamps. Ethan knew power lived in understanding and time. One side rushed forward. The other waited. That night, light rain fell, not enough to refill the creek, but enough for Ethan to recognize a disturbing truth. The water was not flowing away. It was being held, forced, accumulated in places never designed to withstand it. In the quiet, Ethan stood by the window, listening to rain tap a steady rhythm on the roof. He thought about the people sleeping downstream, unaware that their fragile balance was being gambled with. He thought about Linda, convinced she was building the future. This was no longer a misunderstanding. It was an unavoidable collision between memory and ambition, between natural flow and artificial lines. And at its center stood Ethan Cole, the man they believed was the weakest, holding the peace the entire town would soon be forced to face. The gavel struck the tabletop with a dry, chilling crack inside the small city hall meeting room, like a verdict that had been prepared long before anyone took their seats. Ethan sat in the back row, silently watching as a sign reading "Emergency Safety Review" was placed in front of the podium. No one turned to look at him. In their eyes, he was just a troublesome landowner, a man standing in the way of progress and the familiar illusion of stability they were used to. No one realized that in that exact moment, Ethan could already see the entire picture with ruthless clarity. Linda Harrow stood in the front row, back straight, hands neatly resting on a thick folder. She did not need to look at Ethan. She addressed the council, the local press, and the cameras poised to capture every nod of agreement. Her voice was steady, filled with familiar words like safety, responsibility, and the future of children. She called the dam outdated. She called the creek a potential hazard. And she called Ethan, not directly, but unmistakably, a risk that needed to be controlled. In that moment, Ethan felt public opinion being shaped like soft clay. A few furrowed brows, a few whispered comments. A young mother watched him with guarded eyes. A middle-aged man gave a small shake of his head, as if ready to accept any conclusion as long as it came stamped with the word expert. Ethan thought back to other meetings, in places far from here, where decisions were made under time pressure and incomplete information. He had seen the consequences of those choices. He knew that when one side of a story is told long enough, it becomes the only truth people allow themselves to believe. The meeting ended sooner than expected. An independent review team would be assigned. The landowner was advised to limit access to the dam area. Another step in what Linda believed was a flawless plan. She left the room with a small, controlled smile. Not the burst of victory, but the quiet satisfaction of someone convinced she was on the right path. Ethan walked out last. No one stopped him. No one thought he had anything left to say. The late afternoon sun spilled across the building steps, lighting his face, which showed none of the collapse they expected, only a sharpening focus. That evening, in the old wooden house, Ethan called a lawyer he had been referred to by an old friend. The conversation was brief, dry, filled with legal terminology. The consultation fee was mentioned, a number large enough to make most people hesitate. Ethan did not. But when the call ended, he knew this road would be long, and it was not meant for those who relied solely on local courts. He opened his computer and logged into public archives. Digitized documents appeared, layered and chaotic. Ethan patiently turned page after page, tracing the outline of a story that had been buried. Old construction permits, hydrology maps from decades earlier, handwritten notes no one paid attention to anymore. Meanwhile, Linda sat in her spacious living room under soft lighting, a glass of wine resting loosely in her hand. She watched the evening news, where footage of the old dam played beneath concerned commentary. She saw herself on the screen, calm, reasonable, the embodiment of order. She believed the story had been told, that the public had chosen a side. The plot twist did not arrive with a dramatic act. It arrived in a single overlooked line Ethan found near midnight, a small note buried in an old file, referencing the dam's construction with consultation from an agency most people in town had never considered. Not local, not county. Another level of authority, quiet, but immense. Ethan leaned back in his chair and exhaled slowly. The pieces began to align. The council's haste, Linda's confidence, the evasiveness. When he asked about the right to divert the creek, all of it pointed to one truth. They had built an entire safety narrative on a foundation they did not fully understand. Outside, wind moved through the trees, carrying the scent of water and earth. Ethan stood, opened the door, and looked toward the dam in the darkness. He felt no excitement. He felt responsibility. Not just to this land, but to everyone being pulled into a story they had never fully heard. The game had changed, not because Ethan raised his voice, but because he had found a place where Linda's voice could not reach. From that moment on, the balance began to shift, slowly but irreversibly. Ethan knew he had touched something they never wanted anyone to reach when the reply email arrived just minutes later, brief, cold, and carrying the unmistakable weight of a level of authority that never showed up in any local meeting room. He read each line slowly, feeling like he had just heard a metal lock click perfectly into place. The old note he had found the night before was not meaningless. It was a key. The dam had been built with federal consultation, a project designed for flood control and downstream protection, not as decoration for any residential development. From that moment on, the story was no longer in the town council's hands. That morning, Ethan drove along the creek from its upper reaches to where it disappeared behind newly poured concrete walls. He stopped, took notes, snapped photos, and measured water levels using simple but precise tools. Every measurement point became a piece of evidence. Every number was a silent rebuttal. He worked like someone who had operated in places where small errors could cost lives. Downstream, he met Mr. Martin, a gray-haired farmer with hands hardened by years of labor. The man stood staring at a cracked, dry irrigation channel, his expression caught between anger and helplessness. He said the pond had dried earlier than usual this year, that the cattle were drinking less, that he had called the town and received nothing but vague reassurances. When Ethan mentioned the creek diversion, Mr. Anaconda's Martin fell silent for a long time, then nodded, as if something had finally been named correctly. Rumors spread faster than any official statement. A retired teacher recalled years of heavy rain when the old dam opened its gates at the right time and kept the entire valley safe. A small shop owner noticed the well water smelled different. Scattered stories began to connect, forming a picture Linda had never seen, or had chosen not to see. Inside the Homeowners Association office, Linda began to sense the shift. Not through public opposition, but through short phone calls and difficult questions. A local reporter asked about permits for diverting the creek. A council member asked about downstream impact assessments. Linda stayed calm, but her grip tightened around her pen. She was not used to being questioned from behind the scenes. Ethan called an old friend, an environmental engineer who had worked on cases this town had never heard of. The conversation was brief, but enough to confirm Ethan's suspicion. If the dam fell under federal jurisdiction, then any alteration to water flow required review at that level. There were no exceptions for convenience, and no shortcuts for rapid development. This was the real plot twist. While Linda believed her power came from local networks and surface-level support, Ethan had stepped onto a different board altogether. Here, names mattered less than data. Words mattered less than documentation. And time, the tool Linda used to apply pressure, became Ethan's ally. In the days that followed, Ethan worked with almost no sleep. Days were spent meeting residents, nights were devoted to reviewing records. He found old hydrology maps showing the creek winding naturally with the terrain, then compared them to newer maps where the flow had been forced into cold, straight lines. The difference was not just geometry, it was philosophy. One side respected nature, the other tried to dominate it. Linda reacted quickly. A new press release went out, emphasizing safety and progress. Another meeting was scheduled, this time with hired experts. But even within her own team, certainty began to crack. A young assistant quietly asked whether the legal scope of the dam should be reconsidered. Linda brushed it off. She could not slow down. Slowing down would mean admitting something was wrong. That evening, Ethan stood by the dam, watching water reflect pale moonlight. He remembered opening the spillway with his grandfather. No noise, no spectacle, just doing what needed to be done at the right moment. He knew the confrontation ahead would not be gentle. But he also knew he was no longer alone, not because of crowds, but because the truth was beginning to stand on its own. Somewhere in town, Linda stared at her packed meeting schedule, feeling an unease she could not explain. She did not yet know the balance had started to tilt. Quietly. Without warning. In a slow and irreversible shift, as what had been hidden for too long finally found its way back to the surface. The mental health evaluation notice was taped to the old wooden door early one morning. Like an accusation that required no evidence, Ethan stood there watching the paper tremble lightly in the wind, clearly sensing the moment the game had changed its rhythm. This was no longer about files or maps. This was a direct strike at a person's dignity, at their identity. A familiar tactic, cold and calculated, and highly effective if the target did not recognize what they were facing. The social worker arrived on time. Her voice was gentle, her eyes cautious. She followed a script she clearly knew by heart, speaking about concern, about community responsibility, about anonymous reports expressing worries over safety. Ethan listened and responded slowly. He did not raise his voice. He did not defend himself. He simply stated the facts, cleanly and methodically, the same way he once handled technical reports. When the conversation ended, she left looking unsettled. Something did not align between the story she had been given and the man she had just met. In town, a ripple began to spread, not through cheers, but through glances and whispers. Some people avoided Ethan's eyes at the store. Others looked at him longer than usual, as if deciding what to believe. Linda Harrow understood the power of doubt very well. She had planted it, believing it would grow fast enough to choke off any resistance. The next council meeting took place in an atmosphere stretched tight as a wire. Linda opened calmly, stressing that every step was taken to protect the community. She spoke of legal responsibility, of risk, of professional assessment still underway, then subtly mentioned the landowner's mental health as a side detail, just enough to deepen suspicion. Ethan sat at the back of the room. He was not invited to speak. No one thought he had anything left to add. In that moment, many believed the story was already over. A lone man, now questioned for his stability, standing against an entire system. The plot twist did not happen at the podium, but in a narrow hallway behind it. A young council member, newly appointed, pulled Ethan aside and lowered his voice. He asked about the dam, asked about jurisdiction, asked whether the council might have overstepped its authority. Those questions did not exist if everything was truly clear. At the same time downstream, Mr. Martin and several other farmers gathered by a drained pond. They talked, for the first time not just complaining, but comparing notes. The water levels dropped at the same time, in the same pattern. One of them decided to call a journalist he knew, not to accuse, just to ask. Linda began to feel the ground beneath her shift. Her phone rang more often. The questions grew harder to deflect. She responded by applying more pressure, more inspections, more paperwork, more notices. Each move was legally sound on the surface, but underneath it was controlled panic. Ethan shifted into silent work. He organized every piece of evidence, water level photos, residents' accounts, old maps beside new ones. He did not post online. He did not seek sympathy. He sent everything to places Linda could not control with a single phone call. That evening, Ethan sat alone at the kitchen table, yellow light pooling over a growing stack of files. He thought about how easily a person's reputation could be twisted, just like the creek itself. He thought about those who stayed silent out of fear of being labeled, and he understood why this tactic worked so well. It made people doubt themselves. Outside, rain began to fall heavily, not enough to flood, but enough to test the newly built artificial channels. Ethan put on his jacket and stepped onto the porch, watching water run across hardened ground. In several spots it pooled, unable to find a path forward. He took note. Everything leaves traces. At Linda's house, the lights stayed on late. She reviewed reports, searching for familiar certainty, but instead felt watched by unanswered questions. She did not know that her strongest attack had backfired. By turning Ethan into a suspect, she had caused others to start questioning who the system was really protecting. Ethan stepped back inside and closed the door, leaving the steady sound of rain behind him. In that quiet, he did not feel isolated. He felt clearer than ever. This fight had moved beyond the personal. And when truth is pushed into a corner, it does not disappear. It finds another way to speak. The sound of old metal echoed through the night as Ethan slowly turned the test valve. A low, grinding hiss like the breath of something that had been asleep for far too long. He stopped instantly, heart pounding, not from fear, but from recognition. Beneath layers of moss and dirt, behind a faded warning sign, was an emergency spillway system no one on the council had ever mentioned. Not decoration, not a relic. A mechanism designed to do one thing, at the exact moment it was needed. Ethan knelt down, tracing the pipes running deep into the dam with his flashlight. In that instant, memories surged back with painful clarity. His grandfather stood beside him, one hand on the lever, voice steady and firm. When the water rises too fast, do not argue with it. Give it a way through. A dam is not built to stop water. It is built to guide it. The next morning, Ethan met with Helen Brooks, the attorney he had been referred to after weeks of silence. She was not young. Her eyes were sharp, her words precise. Ethan did not speak at length. He placed the file on her desk and opened it to the necessary pages. Old maps, federal consultation records, notes outlining the original purpose of the structure. Helen read slowly. The more she read, the quieter she became. When she finally looked up, her expression had changed. No longer curiosity, but confirmation. She told him that if what he presented was accurate, the dam was not merely private property. It was part of a protected water management system, operating at a level far above this town. And more importantly, he did not just have the right to act. He had a duty. That was the twist. While Linda Harrow was trying to paint Ethan as a danger, the law was placing responsibility on his shoulders to protect the natural flow. Doing nothing would be wrong. Failing to intervene would be a violation. The silence Linda had forced on him turned out to be the trap closing around her instead. Helen advised him to prepare carefully, not to shock anyone, but to ensure the truth could not be twisted when the moment came. She began drafting the first documents, sending notices Linda could not block with phone calls or connections. Everything had to be recorded, time-stamped, witnessed. Around town, the atmosphere shifted slowly but unmistakably. People who once avoided Ethan now nodded in passing. A few stopped to talk, not openly supportive, but no longer avoiding him. They had seen enough to doubt the single story they had been given. Downstream, Mr. Martin and other farmers gathered by the pond's edge. Ethan joined them, not to lecture, but to listen. They spoke about old drought years, about the time the dam opened and water returned exactly when it was needed. When Ethan mentioned the emergency spillway, they exchanged looks. No one seemed surprised, as if the shared memory had never disappeared, only gathered dust. Linda noticed the shift through small details. A meeting postponed for lack of attendance. A reporter asking for additional documentation. An email from above with questions she could not immediately answer. She reacted on instinct, pushing timelines faster, increasing pressure. But every rushed move now left traces. That evening, the weather forecast was released. A major rain system was forming, moving slowly but steadily. Not a storm, not enough to cause panic, but enough to test artificial channels that had never carried real load. Ethan read the forecast twice, then a third time. He returned to the dam at dusk. The wind carried a heavier scent of water. He walked along the structure, placing his hand against the cold surface, feeling subtle vibrations beneath. This was not rebellion. This was preparation, the kind made by someone who understands that nature does not wait for human consensus. In Linda's large house, the lights remained on. She reviewed schedules, rearranged meetings, trying to keep everything within her familiar frame of control. But deep down, unease crept in, not because of what Ethan was doing, but because of what he was not doing. His calm made him unreadable. Night fell, and rain began to tap softly. Ethan stood alone by the spillway lever, not touching it. He knew the time had not yet come, but he also knew that when it did, he would not hesitate. Not out of resentment, not to prove a point, but because the dam had been built for that exact moment. In the steady sound of rain, Ethan whispered, as if speaking to someone long gone, "I am ready." And somewhere deep beneath the ground, the water seemed to answer with a slow, powerful rhythm. Unstoppable. The steel gate shuddered violently in the heavy rain as unfamiliar hands tried to force the valve in the opposite direction. The sound woke Ethan in the middle of the night, not because of the noise itself, but because of instinct forged in far worse situations. He threw on his jacket, grabbed a flashlight, and rushed outside as the rain intensified, the beam slicing across the dam like a blade cutting through darkness. In the light, 3 figures stumbled back in panic. Concrete-stained gloves, tools hastily concealed. A half-finished act, but dangerous enough to turn the dam into a real threat. They fled before Ethan could say a word, but the cameras did not. The unblinking eyes mounted on wooden posts captured everything: faces, movements, even the license plate of a vehicle parked not far away. In that instant, Ethan understood a line had been crossed. This was no longer a paperwork dispute or a moral argument. Someone was now willing to create real danger to maintain control. By morning, the sky was slate gray, and the rain had not stopped. Forecasts warned the system would linger, slow but relentless, pushing water toward the upper basin. Ethan did not wait. He called Helen Brooks. Her voice was calm, almost cold. This was the moment. Not for debate, but for action. Lawful and precisely timed. Notices were sent out to federal authorities, local fire departments, and the town office. Everything was time-stamped. Everything was transparent. Ethan posted warning signs, went door to door downstream, knocked, and explained briefly. No promises, no threats, just the truth. The water would be guided back to its original path. In the new development, Linda Harrow jolted awake to a flood of calls. Someone mentioned warnings. Someone mentioned opening the spillway. She rushed onto her balcony, watching the creek darken, hearing a different tone in the moving water. The familiar scenarios in her mind no longer fit. She made calls. No one answered right away. For the first time, control slipped from her grasp. As dawn broke through the low clouds, Ethan stood at the control panel. He took a deep breath. There was no audience, no speech, only rain, wind, and responsibility as heavy as the dam itself. He turned the valve to the calculated angle, slow, steady, controlled. The sound of redirected water did not roar. It whispered, like breath released at last. The flow found its old channel, spreading through bends that had been forced out of shape. Downstream, water rose just enough to fill empty ponds and soak into dry soil. No homes flooded. No panic followed. Only return. Reporters arrived. Cameras rolled. Linda appeared, voice sharp and urgent, calling it dangerous. But behind her, the images told a different story. The creek, running along its historical course, a farmer standing still, eyes wet, a child kneeling to touch the water for the first time after weeks of drought. The plot twist unfolded live on camera. What had been labeled a threat was the very thing keeping people safe. What had been praised as development was the source of risk. When federal experts confirmed the flow matched historical data, the accusations dissolved like wet clay. Ethan said little. He stepped aside and let the truth move on its own. In the eyes of those who once doubted him, he saw the shift, not because he had won, but because they had just witnessed a system restored to its true purpose. As afternoon faded, the rain eased. The creek stabilized, quiet but alive. Ethan returned home soaked, exhausted, yet lighter. He knew the conflict was not over. Paperwork, hearings, and responsibility still lay ahead. But this moment had laid a foundation that could not be erased. Before closing the door, Ethan looked back at the flowing water and thought of stories still untold, of people underestimated, of communities overlooked. If you have ever witnessed or lived through a similar story, share your thoughts. Like if you believe truth deserves to be seen. And follow along so you do not miss what comes next, where every consequence will finally be named. The project suspension order was issued before the ground had even dried, like a clean cut that abruptly ended the noise the neighborhood once believed was untouchable. The news spread fast, faster than the rain could recede. The construction site fell silent. Concrete mixers stood frozen like trapped animals. Bright signs advertising a flawless future suddenly looked out of place in the mud. Inside the council office, phones rang without pause, each call carrying a question no one dared to answer too quickly. Ethan stood by the creek, watching the water stabilize, flowing in its proper rhythm. He did not celebrate. He knew that when truth begins to move, it pulls other forces with it. Insurance companies, banks, regulators. None of them like surprises, and they had just received one big enough to demand attention. At the insurance headquarters, teams of analysts reopened files, past declarations, safety checkmarks, statements claiming no seasonal flood risk. When new data hit the table, old confidence collapsed. Artificial straight lines on maps could no longer hide the historical flow. One call was made, then another. The process activated like falling dominoes. At the bank, loans tied to the project's progress were re-examined. Disbursement conditions had been built on assumptions about redirected water flow. Those assumptions no longer held. Numbers on screens shifted tone. No one needed to raise their voice. A single pause was enough to make the financial gears hesitate. Linda Harrow received the news in the familiar meeting room where she once orchestrated everything with calm authority. This time her voice wavered, not from fear, but from shock. She flipped through papers, searching for a familiar exit. But every path led to the same question she had avoided for too long. Who did the creek truly belong to? The plot twist became undeniable when an independent report was released. It carried no moral judgment, only data, flow rates, gradients, impact zones. The report spoke in an emotionless language, and that was precisely why it was brutal. It confirmed what Ethan had said from the beginning. The diversion had exceeded authority. The construction had ignored downstream risk. Earlier reassurances now stood as evidence of negligence. In town, eyes shifted again. This time they were not questioning Ethan, but wondering why they had trusted a one-sided story for so long. A mother recalled her fear during heavy rain. A construction worker remembered rushed instructions. A young council member reread old minutes and noticed unexplained gaps. Ethan was invited in, not to defend himself, but to explain. He spoke slowly and clearly. Nothing more, nothing less. He did not use grand language. He used maps. He used timelines. He used the community's memory, verified by data. The people across from him realized something uncomfortable. They had misjudged him from the start. At Linda's home, the lights stayed on late. She looked out over a perfectly arranged garden. She had once believed order was the result of control. Now she saw order was the result of understanding. That difference could not be patched over with press releases or smiles. Outside, the creek flowed through familiar bends, carrying fresh silt and signs of life. Mr. Martin stood by the bank and nodded quietly, as if greeting an old friend. A retired teacher paused to listen to a sound she thought had been lost. Small moments, but enough to measure the value of a right decision. Ethan returned home at dusk and sat on the steps, letting the wind carry the scent of water closer. He knew the hardest part was still ahead, hearings to come, responsibilities to face. But he also knew that once truth stands on its own, it does not need to be held up. In that gentle silence, the town began to relearn an old lesson. Progress is not about forcing every curve straight. Safety does not come from blinding people. And real power does not belong to the loudest voice, but to the one who knows when to let water find its own path. The verdict was read inside a closed room, so brief that many people barely had time to breathe. There was no applause, no gloating, only the feeling that an era had just ended, like floodwater pulling back and revealing what had been hidden for far too long. The council was forced to stop the entire plan. Decisions made beyond its authority were withdrawn. Responsibility was called by its proper name, not with rage, but with clarity that could not be denied. Ethan stood at the back of the room, spine straight, one hand resting lightly on an old hat. He did not look at Linda Harrow as she lowered her head and signed the final documents. In that moment, Linda felt something she had never felt before. Not the loss of power, but the emptiness of someone realizing she had been fighting something she did not understand. She once believed she represented order. Now, she saw that order did not need her to represent it. Outside, the town let out a long breath. There was no celebration, only slower conversations, eyes meeting without flinching away. A construction worker took off his cap, wiped his forehead, and said that at last he could sleep in peace. A mother walked her child along the creek bank, pointing out that the water was flowing exactly as the old stories said it should. The final plot twist was not in the ruling itself. It was in what happened afterward. When everything was over, Ethan refused offers to step into local politics. He did not want a seat. He did not want a title. He asked for only one thing, that the dam and the creek be managed according to their original purpose, no more, no less. The people who once saw him as a troublemaker now looked at him with quiet respect. They understood that real power does not need display. It lives in the ability to stand firm when isolated, in patience when misunderstood, and in choosing to act not for victory or defeat, but for what is right. The next rainy season arrived without spectacle. Water rose and receded in its familiar rhythm. The dam worked as it had been designed to for generations. Downstream, irrigation ponds filled again. The soil softened. Trees revived. Mr. Martin stood by the fence watching his cattle drink, his eyes carrying a wordless relief. Ethan often came to the dam in the late afternoons. He did not inspect it. He listened. Water moved through the bends without rushing, without being forced. He thought of his grandfather, of the times they stood together in silence, of lessons never written down but lasting longer than any document. Linda Harrow left town not long after. No one saw her off. No one held a grudge. Her story became a quiet reminder that good intentions cannot replace understanding, and that development without respect for its foundation only creates hidden risk. Time passed. New houses were built again, this time set farther back from the creek, respecting the water's path. Children learned at school about the valley's history, about a dam built not to block, but to protect. The story was retold not as a battle, but as a shared lesson. One evening, Ethan sat on his porch as the wind carried the clean scent of water. He did not think of himself as a hero. He was simply the one who listened when others did not. He understood that the most important fights are rarely loud. They happen in steadiness, in small choices repeated with endurance. Under moonlight, the creek shimmered and kept flowing, carrying away disputes that had finally settled. It did not remember accusations. It did not remember meetings. It remembered only its path. And in that return, the town learned something simple and difficult. When people are willing to step back in order to understand, nature gives them more than they expected.